Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where we pick apart the characters from some of our favorite games to figure out who is a friend, someone we don't need to worry will stab us in the back, and who is a foe, someone who would intentionally bring harm to the group if given the chance. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're heading back to the Wild West to break down Micah Bell. As always, you can find a link in the description to a playlist for this series for those long nights where you just want to sit back, relax, and listen to a bunch of breakdowns all at once. Micah Bell is one of the newest members of the Vanderland gang in Red Dead Redemption 2, having only joined the gang a few months prior to the opening credits of the game. He is rough around the edges to say the very least, and no one in the gang aside from Dutch really seems to like him. His attitude toward women is especially egregious, but he doesn't limit his hate and bigotry to any one person or group, as he spends the better part of most interactions treating anyone and everyone who isn't in charge like they belong under his boot. The thing that is most surprising, though, is how little screen time he actually gets in the game, considering his role in the fall of the Vanderland gang. There aren't really a lot of missions that he is present for, and even when he is around, he usually fades into the background. But what makes him tick? And is he really as bad as you remember? The first time we see Micah Bell in the course of the game is early on in Chapter 1. He meets up with Dutch and Arthur in the middle of a snowstorm to report that he's found some possible help for the gang in the form of a cabin that seems to be hosting a pretty raucous party. It turns out the cabin is full of members of the O'Driscoll gang, the arch rivals of the Vanderlands. And while it isn't quite as easy to get supplies as they'd hoped because of that, they do wind up getting some food to take back. And early on, Micah really seems like nothing more than just a typical troll. He goads people on and intentionally riles them up just for fun, while not really seeming to add much to the group overall. He spends the first couple of chapters of the game either antagonizing other members or locked in jail, and you even have the option to leave him in Strawberry for a considerable amount of time with no complaints from anyone except Dutch. But just being an overall nuisance and not helping out much around camp would put him more in line with someone like Uncle than someone who is an actual foe, so we have to dig a little deeper to try to figure him out. The first major ding against him is actually tied to the predicament that the gang finds themselves in at the start of the game. They're up in the mountains, trying to find shelter from a blizzard, and it turns out the failed robbery that put them there was Micah's idea all along. The gang had been staying just outside the town of Blackwater, with a few possible robberies and con jobs lined up, when Micah started pushing Dutch to rob a ferry down at the docks. Not a lot is known about what all went down, but the job went really sideways, and Dutch wound up killing a girl before they all made their escape into the snow. Jumping forward a bit, Micah and Lenny are sent ahead to scout for possible Pinkertons as the rest of the gang make their way down to set up camp at Horseshoe Overlook. And Micah winds up causing more trouble than he's worth again as he gets arrested in Strawberry. Arthur eventually has to rescue him, but even Lenny can't quite figure out how Micah managed to get himself locked up in the first place.
I kept asking him what we was doing, but he was, "You worry too much, kid. Just some business to attend to, kid. You know how he is."
Yes, I do.
He was half soaked before we even got there. Then we ran into some fellas. One of them Micah knew, drank some more. And this is supposed to be a dry town we're in, too.
And then he shoots one of them. I know how that goes.
Couldn't even tell you quite how. Happened like the strike of a match. The law was on us fast, too.
The jailbreak would have been bad enough, but it gets worse as Micah leads Arthur on a shootout through the small resort town because he wants to make a stop at an old acquaintance's house to pick up some guns before they leave town. This means killing a lot more people than they needed to, but it also means putting Arthur and himself at even more risk than is needed. And putting others at risk is one of Micah's specialties, as just about every job he's involved in, whether being a part of the planning or just being there as part of the robbery, turns into a mess. There are a couple of smaller robberies he plans, with one of them winding up getting him and Arthur ambushed, and the other kind of going alright, while being a little more guarded than he planned. These aren't atypical when it comes to the gang, but they are worth mentioning as they would almost suggest that Micah did care about the overall well-being of the gang and wanting to make things better for everyone. Except that goodwill is thrown out when he starts throwing around the idea of trimming the fat, bringing into question his motives and giving the first real clue for where this whole thing is headed. During one of the robberies Micah plans in Chapter 4, he mentions to Arthur that the gang would be a lot better off if they got rid of the women and children, focusing instead on having a small group of 4 to 5 strong gunmen to carry out their jobs. If the goal of the gang was simply to make money and rob people, like some of the more ruthless gangs in the game, this might make some sense. The O'Driscolls, for instance, don't have any families with them, and they almost seem to be doing better at times from the outside looking in. But one of the big things that Dutch has always focused on was making the world a better place for everyone. The Vanderlyn gang has always been a refuge for the downtrodden, whether they're men, women, or children, and that has set them apart and allowed them a little more wiggle room, morally speaking, than others who cause chaos just for the sake of causing chaos. But this lifestyle doesn't jive with someone like Micah, who is really only in it for himself. He sees anyone who can't pull their weight, so to speak, as a waste of space and resources. In the beginning, he's the only one who really thinks that way, but over the course of the story, he starts working on Dutch and even winds up roping in Bill and Javier as he lobbies for a more ruthless way of doing things. And ultimately, that becomes the downfall of the gang as a whole, with the wedge driven by Micah breaking up the family-friendly atmosphere in favor of death and destruction at all costs. A gang where you can't trust those around you to look out for you, where you have to fight for scraps as those at the top hoard everything and demand more and more, isn't a group that's going to survive in the long term. What isn't as clear, however, is whether or not Micah intended to break up the gang, or if the downfall was merely a byproduct of his actions. This is an important distinction in the Friend or Foe series specifically because intention can mean a world of difference in figuring out whether there is anything redeemable about a person. If, for instance, Micah was out for himself because of some past trauma, and having his errors pointed out to him would be enough to change the course of things, it could be said that he was simply a decent person who made a mistake. On the other hand, if he is acting with malice, intending to tear down the group from within and rebuild it in his image, or just because he wants to watch the world burn, it would be easy to argue that he is completely irredeemable. Intention isn't an easy thing to suss out most of the time because you have to rely on a combination of the person's actions and words to truly figure things out. Actions alone can be seen to mean any number of things, and it's pretty common to find people with different backgrounds and life experiences interpreting an individual's actions in very different ways. Words can easily be lies, with the person saying they meant something that they didn't to get themselves out of trouble or to gain a reward they aren't entitled to. With Micah, we can see this in action, as there are times where he lies about his true intentions, saying he likes Arthur or that he wants to see the gang succeed, even as we see his actions in the later part of the game prove those things wrong. He actively works to break the gang up, doing things like convincing Dutch to leave John behind and to abandon Abigail after she's taken by Milton. And speaking of Agent Milton from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, now is about as good a time as any to bring up the biggest betrayal that Micah is guilty of. Milton confesses to Arthur that Micah had been feeding him information ever since the gang returned from Guarma. Micah denies this, of course, but it fits really well with what we know of his character, and would be a really weird detail to include if it wasn't true. I can picture in my mind a scenario where Micah was cornered by Milton and a few other agents shortly after making it on shore. And since their main target was Dutch, they might have offered him the same kind of deal that they made with Arthur back in Chapter 2. Being less loyal than Arthur and wanting nothing more than to save his own skin, Micah would have agreed to help Milton bring down the gang and started really ramping up his efforts to get close to Dutch. This really fits well with what we see in the game too, as Micah had more or less stayed around the inner circle without getting too close for most of the early chapters. But he and Dutch seem almost tied together at the hip in the latter chapters. Dutch even says a couple of times that he and Micah are working on plans for the future, implying Micah is driving a lot of what happens post-Guarma. Besides that, the actual scene where Milton divulges the information to Arthur happens when Milton has the upper hand. He thinks Arthur is going to be dead in moments and would gain nothing by telling him that Micah was a traitor.
Sure. Tuberculosis. I'll be dead soon. And you with me, Mr. Milton.
You'll be dead, sure. But I'm gonna be just fine. We offered you a deal, Mr. Morgan. Should have taken it.
I'm a fool, Mr. Milton.
Not all you boys have quite so many scruples. Old Micah Bell,
Micah, you mean Molly?
Molly O'Shea, sweated her a couple of times, never talked a word, had to let her go. Micah Bell, we picked him up when you boys came back from the Caribbean, and he's been a good boy ever since.
So with all of that, it's time to decide whether Micah is a friend or a foe. It's pretty clear that his intentions from the beginning were ill, and he put himself above everyone else in the gang at all times. He was mean and nasty, and he, on more than one occasion, showed his true colors as a racist and a misogynist. When given the chance to stay loyal to Dutch and the gang, he chose to betray them outright and cemented himself as a foe by every metric that I have. This series relies heavily on the intentions of the character that we're breaking down. Are they someone that would betray the group, or can they be trusted? If they would betray the group, would it be for a reason that could be justified in the long run as beneficial to the group's survival? Actions aren't usually black and white, good or bad. There is a lot of nuance, and understanding that nuance takes a lot of work and some concessions. If Micah had just been some young man who made a few mistakes and treated people poorly because he didn't know any better or hadn't grown up, it might be possible to make a case for him just being young, dumb, and full of shit without actually being considered a foe. People like that often wind up hitting a point, usually through an event or series of events that bring their flaws to the forefront, where they grow up and even show regret for their prior actions. In fact, many older people who yell the loudest about how irresponsible or bad younger people are being often wind up having some pretty wild past themselves, and are only speaking up because they regret their own actions and wish that they had been smarter in their own youth. In Micah's case, however, his actions seem ingrained in who he is at the core, rather than just being youthful transgressions. He is a threat to everyone around him, and he is incapable of basic empathy, meaning he can't relate to others and would just as quickly shoot someone as look at them. He's also always looking for someone to step on as he makes his way to the top, and if he'd been born in a more modern era, he might have been a self-help guru or a politician. He gravitates towards power, and is always looking for ways to manipulate those who wield it, which is why he digs in so deep with Dutch. But that's just my take on Micah, and now it's time for you to share your thoughts on him in the comments below. Maybe I was a little too hard on him and somehow missed some act of charity that should have landed him in the friend box. Let me know below if you agree with my verdict, or if I was way off base. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes of Friend or Foe, hit the like button on this video and subscribe to Lost in Games on YouTube. We've got a lot of great characters to cover in the coming weeks, and you aren't going to want to miss any of them. If you want to help the channel out in other ways, I've got a Patreon, channel memberships on YouTube, and a membership program on my website where chipping in just a couple of bucks a month helps me keep making great series like Friend or Foe and Philosophy and Ethics in Games, while getting your name on the screen in videos and more. That's all I've got for this one. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.